Just like in the previous essay and like in any discussion essay really, you're going to have two body paragraphs which contrast with one another. And that means that when you open your second body paragraph, you can use an expression that helps to highlight that sense of contrast. Last time, if you remember, we used nevertheless. This time, we'll use however. I would suggest just using one that ideally you haven't used before or won't use later in your essay. So, however, it's the only time it appears in this essay, so it's okay. However, care homes, so that's what we're focusing on here, the problems of care homes. Care homes for the elderly, similar to last time, also present some disadvantages. However, using that term again, however, last time we ended the sentence here. This time we're going to use a comma and we're going to introduce the first disadvantage. And we're going to introduce it with a nice turn of phrase, the most obvious of which is. The most obvious of which is. This is a really nice way of switching from talking about disadvantages, advantages, problems, benefits all together as a group, and then moving into looking at one individually. And you can change the superlative here to whatever you want. It might be, depending on what you're talking about, whether it's advantages or disadvantages, problems, causes, whatever, it could be something like the most important of which is, the most significant of which is, the biggest of which is, the clearest of which is, whatever you think is most appropriate. I'm writing most obvious of which here because the disadvantage to me seems very obvious. It's the first one that came to mind and it came in a split second. So we'll say, present some disadvantages, the most obvious of which is, and then, just like in the plan, the lack of loved ones around. Notice that I've dropped out the definite article in the plan, but I've made sure to include it in the essay itself. When you have a noun of noun, one's the noun here, most of the time this will be that first noun will be preceded by a definite article. Not all the time. I recommend watching the lecture on articles, on simple sentences and on articles in the Task 2 course if you are a little bit confused around this kind of language. But we'll move on for now, and we're moving on to that support sentence. And as I said earlier, I want this support sentence to show and demonstrate my ability to write complex sentences. A complex sentence, as we looked at in the conclusion of the previous essay, that will be a case of using a subordinating conjunction like although, while, whereas, that sort of thing, to introduce a dependent clause. And the dependent clause will contain this information about visits. So let's say something like, although it is possible for friends and relatives as well to visit nursing home residents. So instead of saying old people or their relatives, we can say nursing home residents. So we're not saying that they can't be around, we're saying that they can be. So there's that contrast. That's why we're introducing it this way. Now, we've ended that dependent clause. We add a comma. Now we need the independent clause for the sentence to be complete. And the independent clause will look like this. These visits, as in we've turned the verb now into a noun, a nice way of showing word formation and understanding. These visits can be... Okay, what is the prefix that we put in front of frequent to make it not frequent? Is it an un? Is it an im? Is it an in? Hopefully you're telling me it's an infrequent. These visits can be infrequent. Another comma here. And loneliness, just like in the plan here, loneliness is often the, what's the word for a negative result? Consequence is often the consequence. So in a way we've combined a support sentence and a result sentence together. However, we're putting another result on top of that. And a nice way of introducing this follow-up sentence is to make a clear reference to the previous sentence. And this is what I'm going to write. To make matters worse, which is an expression which indicates that we have acknowledged that there is already a problem, but here we're showing how the problem is even worse than we first thought. So we have a problem, here's how the problem is even worse. To make matters worse. To make matters worse. A nice expression for when you're looking at a very negative paragraph. So to make matters worse, and a nice phrase that you can use whenever you want to suggest that, tests have been done and research has been completed. You can say it has been shown that. It has been shown that, you can see here, risk of depression, weak immune system. So those who are lonely, rather than saying loneliness leads to, because you've got loneliness here, we'll say those who are lonely. Those who are lonely are at greater risk of, let's say, becoming depressed. And now I can't really say weakening, because if we say they are greater risk of weakening their immune system, it almost sounds like it's them doing it intentionally. So we don't really want to use weakening here, but we'll try to make it in passive in a way. So having they're at greater risk of having their immune system weakened. So we'll turn it into that passive voice there. To make matters worse, it has been shown that those who are lonely are at greater risk of becoming depressed and having their immune system weakened. Okay, we can end that sentence there. Lovely grammar that we've used as well, showing our mixture of active and passive voice. And now we can move into the second disadvantage. And this time we're just going to go with a simpler cohesive device. We'll just go with a furthermore. So furthermore, and what have we got here? Surrounded by illness. So care home residents, we talked about nursing home residents, we'll now say care home residents, are often surrounded, just like in the plan, helps to speed me up, surrounded by illness. And I also said death earlier as well, quite a morbid situation, but it's what we have to write about. Care home residents are often surrounded by illness and death. And that result sentence, what's the result of that? So we can use as a result, we could use as a result, but I'm going to be a little bit more original, I suppose, in this sentence, not rely too much on cohesive devices. You can overuse cohesive devices. It is in the band descriptors that overuse is a thing, so don't just throw them in all the time. This time we're going to go with such an environment. So we're referencing the environment, the surroundings. Such an environment is likely to, again, not definitely, but is likely to decrease. Here's a nice synonym, curtail. Curtail. Now, it's not a direct synonym of decrease, but it does have this idea of reducing something, to reduce or to restrict, to deprive, in a way, somebody of something. So it's close enough, and it's certainly appropriate here. Is likely to curtail happiness, and I used the verb earlier, trigger, which is very useful for depression. We talk about triggering depression, and there's a nice collocation here, severe. We talk about severe depression. Very serious is another one, serious depression, so very strong. So trigger severe depression. Okay, so we're showing our understanding of collocations throughout. Not a very nice paragraph to write though. Okay, so we have a word count of 232 words. We really only need to write 18, and then we hit the minimum requirement, so no struggles there. We will wrap this up in the usual way, very similar to the essay before. If you can recall what we did before, we started, as always, with in conclusion and a comma. And then, last time, we used although to create the complex sentence. But this time I've already used although, so maybe I can use something else instead. I could use while, I could use whereas. They're used in quite similar ways structurally to although, but I'm going to try something a little bit trickier here. I'm going to use despite. So despite is a little bit harder because you can't follow it in this simple subject-verb kind of way. There has to be a noun that comes after despite. Also, be very careful here. Do not make the mistake that a lot of people make of writing despite of the benefits. Despite of. It's not despite of. It's in spite of. So in spite of or despite. They mean the same thing, but make sure you don't confuse the two and try to mix them together. So despite the benefits of, and now we just summarize the benefits that we talked about in BP1. So despite the benefits of, we've got professionally trained staff, we've got facilities. Let's go with both of those things here. So specially trained staff and a nice word formation double here. You've got these nice two adverb and adjective combined with a hyphen on both cases. Specially trained, well equipped. So specially trained staff and well equipped facilities that nursing homes can offer the elderly. Okay, now we've reached the end of that dependent clause, comma, despite the benefits of specially trained staff and well equipped facilities that nursing homes can offer the elderly, comma. So notice how it's different. We wouldn't say although the benefits of specially trained staff. If we were to use although the benefits of specially trained staff and well equipped facilities, all of this would be one subject. So although plus the subject, then you'd have to carry on the sentence. But with despite, it's almost like you're moving straight into an object here. You're just completing the thought. So despite the benefits here, then comma, you move on to the second clause, the independent clause now, the drawbacks of, very similar. So the benefits of, the drawbacks of, and then we summarize again, loneliness. It's quite hard to paraphrase that. We've used lonely and then loneliness, so we'll just use it again, loneliness here. The drawbacks of loneliness and depression. And here's a really nice adjective that you can use when you want to say that two things very, very often, almost all the time, go together. It's not always going to be the case that loneliness will go with depression, but because it's so frequent, we can use this adjective here. It's concomitant depression. So when we use this, we're trying to suggest that they go together. They're almost always together. So loneliness and its concomitant depression should also, just like last time where we said it is important to consider, this time we're saying the drawbacks should be considered. It is important to consider this. This is important to consider. You're just changing the structure really. Should also be, and instead of saying considered, we'll say taken into consideration. So you've got a nice passive voice ending the conclusion as well. Again, improving the grammatical range. Okay. I think that looks pretty good. Let's just check on the word count here. We have 266 words. Again, a really nice count. We've really loaded up those body paragraphs. They're nice and full and thorough. We haven't spent too much time on the introduction or the conclusion. So I think we've timed this one very, very well. That should leave us with time to go back and check for errors, but I'm pretty confident there are none here. Please always let me know if I have made an error when going through these. It's important for me to know. It's usually a case of just a lapse in concentration, but it's important for me to know. So do point them out if you see any, or you think you see any. Okay, so that brings us to a close on the discussion essays. Really simple structures: intro, advantages, disadvantages, conclusion. Do make sure that you try and refer to all of the key words. You make references to them within your response. Make sure you develop your ideas beyond a single sentence: support, example, result, alternative, that kind of stuff. Make sure you look at numerous advantages and disadvantages, 2 for each paragraph, and make sure that conclusion also summarizes the main content which you have written about in your essay. Good luck with the vocabulary exercise, which will follow this essay here. And when I see you back here again, we'll be taking a look at a different question type.